April 9th, 1940. The day Norway stopped being Norway. By morning, German warships had slipped through the fog of the Oslo Fjord. By afternoon, the swastika flew above the capital. And by nightfall, a fishing village on the edge of the Sogna Fjord had fallen so quietly that most of its people didn't hear a single shot. But one man heard everything. His name was Sigurd Halvorsen. He was 53 years old, half-deaf in one ear from a childhood accident with a boat motor, and by every visible measure, the least threatening man on the Norwegian coast. He mended nets. He smoked a pipe that smelled of pine tar. He kept a small gray cat named Bjorn. In the 3 years that followed, Sigurd Halvorsen would be responsible for the destruction of 4 German naval patrol vessels, the disruption of 2 major coastal supply routes, and the rescue of 11 Allied airmen. The German High Command never once suspected the fishermen. The village of Eidvåg sat on the southern lip of the Sogna Fjord like a splinter caught in old wood, small, stubborn, and impossible to remove without drawing blood. 31 families, a Lutheran church with a cracked bell, a single-room schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall in winter, and the fjord itself, vast, black, impossibly deep, its walls of granite rising 400 meters on either side, funneling the wind into something that could knock a grown man sideways on a calm day. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. Sigurd had been born in Eidvåg. He expected to die there. He had never once imagined that the years between would include war. He was the son of a fisherman and the grandson of one before that. He had spent 40 years reading the Sogna Fjord the way other men read books, not for pleasure, but for survival. He knew which currents ran cold even in August. He knew where the rocks lurked just beneath the surface at low tide, invisible until they split a hull open. He knew the fjord's moods, its still mornings that turned vicious by noon, its tendency to swallow fog from the west and hold it for days. He knew the underwater geography of the passage near the village of Fresvik, where the bottom rose sharply and unexpectedly, a detail on no German naval chart. He had 3 children, all grown and gone to Bergen or Oslo before the war. His wife, Astrid, had died of pneumonia in 1936. He lived alone in a house that smelled of wood smoke and salt and old wool, and he was, by most accounts, a content man. The Germans arrived in Eidvåg on the 12th of April, 1940. 3 days after the capital fell. There were only 6 of them at first, a small garrison detail assigned to monitor the fjord passage and ensure that no Allied ships or Norwegian fishing boats moved without authorization. They requisitioned the old grain store near the dock as their billet. They hung a flag from the church steeple. They were young, cold, and a little bored. Sigurd watched them from the window of his house and said nothing. He was not a man given to speeches or declarations. He did not weep or rage. He simply observed them, their routines, their patrol schedules, the particular way the young corporal always lit a cigarette at the same spot on the dock each evening at 6. He watched them the way he watched weather, carefully, patiently, without judgment, gathering information for the moment when information would matter. What lit the fire in him quietly, without fanfare, was the morning he saw old Marta Eilertsen, 72 years old and almost blind, stopped on the road by 2 soldiers who demanded she show papers she did not understand. She stood in the cold with her hands shaking while they laughed at her confusion. It lasted 3 minutes. Sigurd stood in his doorway and watched every second of it. He turned back inside, picked up his pipe, and began very calmly to think. He thought about the fjord. He thought about his nets. He thought about the underwater shelf near Fresvik and the way German patrol vessels rode low and heavy in the water, weighted with fuel and crew. He thought about the darkness of the fjord at 2 in the morning and about the German Navy's absolute faith in their own hydrographic charts. He thought about all of these things for 2 weeks. Then he went fishing. The first operation was almost embarrassingly simple. The Germans had established a regular patrol of the Sogna Fjord, using 2 wooden-hulled Kriegsmarine patrol craft repurposed, Norwegian fishing vessels, ironically enough, fitted with mounted guns and new paint. They ran a predictable route twice daily south in the early morning, north in the early evening, that kept to the center of the fjord, well clear of the walls, which was sensible navigation but also predictable to the point of carelessness. Sigurd did not attack them. Not yet. What he did first was study. He began requesting passage permits from the German garrison to fish his traditional grounds, a straightforward process they permitted readily, since a cooperative local fisherman was useful both as optics and as a source of fresh catch, which the garrison corporal had quietly begun purchasing. Sigurd fished dutifully, brought them cod twice a week, and in the process accumulated 17 authorized trips across the fjord over the course of 1 month. On each trip, he measured current speeds, tidal variations, the precise depth soundings near Fresvik, not what the German charts said, but what his own lead line told him. He found what he needed in June. At low tide, in the narrow passage north of Fresvik, there was a submerged granite shelf that rose to within 2 meters of the surface. At high tide, there was clearance enough for any vessel, but at low tide, specifically at the particular tidal phase that occurred twice in any 24-hour period, any vessel drawing more than 6 feet would strike it. The German patrol boats drew approximately 8 feet when fully fueled. The German charts marked this passage as deep and clear. They were wrong. The charts were based on a Norwegian Admiralty survey from 1921 that had been conducted at high water. Sigurd knew this because his father had told him. His father had watched a Norwegian timber barge split its keel on that very shelf in 1994. Now, Sigurd needed a way to direct a German patrol vessel through that passage at the wrong tidal phase. He spent a week thinking. And then he went to see Lars Eriksson. Lars was 26, the youngest fisherman in Eidvad, and he had a temper that had already earned him one official warning from the garrison. Sigurd found him behind his boathouse, drinking aquavit and scowling at the fjord. "I need your help," Sigurd said. "And I need you to say nothing to anyone." Lars looked at him for a long moment. What kind of help? The patient kind. The operation they designed was stripped of everything unnecessary. Simplicity, Sigurd believed, was the truest form of cunning. Complex plans had joints where they could fail. This plan had one moving part. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in late July, Lars Eriksson motored his fishing boat across the Fresvik Passage in the dark. No lights, navigating by memory, and laid 4 of Sigurd's strongest drift nets across the channel mouth. Not to stop anything, not as a barrier, but as a marker. The net's surface buoys were fitted with small white rags that would show, dimly, in the moonlight, on either side of the passage, but positioned so that any vessel attempting to navigate around them would be pushed not toward deep water, but toward the shelf. At 3:15 in the morning, the German North Run patrol vessel came through. The watch crew, seeing the net buoys in the low moonlight, gave the standard command to bear away from the obstacle, bearing away right, exactly as Sigurd had calculated they would, because that was the instinctive direction when the current ran as it was running that night. They struck the Fresvik shelf at 11 knots. The impact was not explosive. It was not cinematic. It was a shuddering groan of wood and metal, a sound that rolled across the fjord like a cough in an empty church. The vessel pivoted hard on the shelf, its hull gashed open along the port side. It did not sink immediately. It wallowed, listing, engine shrieking, for nearly 20 minutes before settling on the shelf in 2 meters of water. The crew got off. No one died. That last fact mattered to Sigurd. He had thought about it carefully. He was not a soldier. He had not set out to kill. He had set out to remove German patrol capacity from the fjord, to create delay, confusion, and the sense that these waters were less safe than the enemy believed. A dead crew would have triggered reprisals against the village. A crew that survived, humiliated and shaken aboard a wreck that embarrassed the garrison, that was a different kind of damage, the kind that spread. The German garrison commander filed a report attributing the grounding to navigational error and faulty charts. He was partially correct. He increased the patrol frequency on the remaining vessel and requested a replacement boat from the district command in Bergen. He did not once look at the fisherman who sold him cod on Thursdays. Over the following 6 months, Sigurd executed 2 more variations of the same basic principle. The second operation used a pattern of floating debris, carefully arranged timber offcuts, and rope, staged to mimic a natural drift field, to push a patrol vessel toward a secondary shoal further up the fjord near Balestrand. This grounding was less severe. The boat survived, but its propeller shaft was bent badly enough to require a Bergen dockyard and 3 weeks off patrol. The third operation was subtler still, a false light, positioned on a promontory using a shielded lantern that mimicked the reflection pattern of the garrison's own dock beacon. A patrol vessel returning in thick fog on a December night followed the false light a quarter-mile off course, ran aground on a gravel bank, and had to be pulled free by a tugboat summoned from Lake Hanger. No damage beyond indignity, but by now, the Fjord was developing a reputation. Crew members requested transfers. Replacement officers arrived and were told, in careful language, that the Sogne Fjord passage required special caution. The garrison commander, a methodical man named Kaupmann Widener, had begun to sense that his charting data was unreliable but had not yet begun to sense that it was being made unreliable. Sigurd continued selling him cod on Thursdays. He was, on all visible evidence, a cooperative and unremarkable old fisherman. In March 1943, everything changed. A new officer arrived in Eidvåg. Oberleutnant Sir C. Franz Muller was 31 years old, a Kriegsmarine veteran of the Norwegian campaign in the North Atlantic, and he had been sent to the Sognefjord district specifically because his superiors had grown tired of losing boats on waterways that should have been straightforward. He was thin, precise, and had the kind of eyes that moved constantly cataloging, calculating, filing away. He did not drink. He did not socialize with his men beyond necessity. He read charts with a magnifying glass and kept a personal logbook of every incident, every anomaly, every deviation from expected pattern. He had, in short, the mind of a fisherman. Sigurd recognized the type immediately. He watched Muller from his window on the afternoon of the man's arrival, the same way he had watched the first garrison detail 3 years before. And for the first time since the occupation began, he felt a cold, deliberate unease settle in his chest. This one would not be fooled by floating timber. Muller's first action was to conduct his own depth survey of the Sogne Fjord passage. He requisitioned a small survey launch from Bergen, assembled a team of 4 men, and spent 5 days running systematic soundings along the entire patrol route, comparing results against the official charts. He found the Fresvik shelf on his second day. He stood in the bow of the survey launch, looking down at the submerged granite that his charts had insisted wasn't there, and said nothing for a long time. Then he turned and looked toward the village. The village was 2 kilometers away across gray water. From that distance, a man in a window was invisible. But Sigurd, watching through the smeared glass of his kitchen pane, felt the officer's gaze as something almost physical, as if the water between them had gone briefly taut. That evening, Muller began conducting informal interviews with the village residents. Routine questions, he said. Community liaison. He was polite, correct, and spoke serviceable Norwegian. He visited Sigurd on the second day. You've been fishing these waters your whole life, Muller said, sitting across the kitchen table, hands folded, looking at Sigurd with those constantly moving eyes. He spoke Norwegian, slowly but accurately. My whole life, Sigurd agreed. You know the Fresvik passage, of course, the shelf there? The one not on the charts. Sigurd scratched the back of his neck, a gesture he had practiced for precisely this kind of conversation, not defensive, not over-eager, simply the motion of a man reaching for a slow thought. There's a shoal there at low tide, yes. Everyone local knows it. I assumed the naval charts had it marked. Muller watched him. They don't. Then someone made an error. Sigurd shrugged. Charts make errors. The fjord doesn't. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. Muller's eyes moved once to the window, once to the net stacked in the corner of the room, once to the gray cat sitting on the counter. You sell fish to Hauptmann Widener, he said. I sell fish to anyone who pays, Sigurd said. Muller stood, thanked him for his time, and left. That night, Sigurd did not sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to the fjord, thinking. He understood that he had perhaps 3 weeks, perhaps less, before Muller assembled enough anomalies into a pattern that pointed toward him. The German was methodical. He was surveying the water now. He would survey the human geography next. He would find, eventually, that every incident on the fjord correlated with a window of time after which Sigurd had been seen on the water. He might not be able to prove it, but he would know. Sigurd needed to do 2 things. First, complete the task that mattered most. For 4 months, he had been quietly facilitating something far more significant than grounded patrol boats. Through a contact in Bergen, a postal clerk named Hakun, who was part of the Malord resistance network, Sigurd had been using his fishing grounds as a waypoint for a chain of communication that ran from the fjord coast to the Shetland bus, the covert network of fishing vessels that ferried Allied agents, escaped prisoners, and intelligence across the North Sea to Britain. The fishing boat traffic he generated was cover. His knowledge of safe anchorages and patrol schedules was the actual product. 11 Allied airmen shot down over western Norway between November 1942 and February 1943 had passed through the waypoint, moved by night, hidden in the holds of what appeared to be ordinary fishing vessels. They had crossed the North Sea and reached Scotland. Sigurd had met only 3 of them, brief, wordless encounters in the pre-dawn dark of a hidden cove 4 kilometers down the shore, where he would leave a lantern lit and supplies cached under a tarpaulin. He had never learned their names. He had not wanted to. The chain was currently holding one more man, a British wireless operator named Fletcher, who had been sheltering in a ruined farm building above the tree line for 9 days, waiting for the weather to allow the crossing. Fletcher needed to move within the next 72 hours, or the window would close for another 3 weeks. Second, Sigurd needed to give Muller something to look at that was not him. He went to Lars Eriksson's house at midnight. "I need the boat," he said, "one last time." Lars looked at him for a long moment. He had grown older in the past 3 years, they all had. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I can't do it myself." Lars was quiet. "When?" "Tomorrow night, before moonrise." The plan was, by necessity, the most complex thing Sigurd had ever attempted. It required precision timing across 3 separate locations and was built on the assumption that Muller, being who he was already watching. At 8 in the evening, Lars Eriksson took his fishing boat out onto the fjord in the last light, following his normal legal route to his nets. This was not unusual. Lars fished evening tides regularly. At 10:30 in the deep dark, Sigurd slipped out of the village on foot, taking the path along the cliff shelf that the garrison had never thought to watch. They watched the roads, not the old walkways. He reached the hidden cove in 40 minutes. Fletcher was there, hollow-eyed and trembling from cold, but upright. Sigurd had no Norwegian. Fletcher had no Norwegian. They communicated with gestures and a scrap of paper on which Håkon had written compass bearings in a hand Sigurd could barely read. Fletcher went into the water at 11:15, swimming the 30 meters to Lars's boat, which had anchored in the dark off the cove's mouth, precisely as arranged. Sigurd then walked back along the cliff path. At midnight, while Lars motored north toward the Shetland bus handoff point, a rendezvous with a vessel that would meet him in open water off Statlandet, Sigurd returned to the village, lit a lamp in his window, and sat at his kitchen table with his net-mending tools spread in front of him and his gray cat on his lap. At 12:40, there was a knock at his door. Muller stood in the dark outside, in his naval coat, without a lantern. He looked at the lamp in the window, at the evidence that it had been lit for some time, and then at Sigurd, who had clearly been sitting at that table for a while. "A late night for network," Muller said. "A man has to do something," Sigurd said, and stepped aside. "Coffee?" Muller did not come in. He stood in the doorway for 5 seconds, looking past Sigurd at the table, the cat, the scattered network. Then he looked at the fjord. Somewhere out there, in the absolute dark, Lars Eriksson and a British wireless operator were running north at low speed with no lights. Muller said nothing. He nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the garrison billet. Sigurd closed the door. He stood with his hand on the wood for a moment, feeling the cold that had come in with the German officer. Then he sat back down, picked up his needle, and returned to the net. His hands were not shaking. He was mildly surprised by this. 3 days later, while Fletcher was already in Scotland, debriefing at a RAF facility in Lurk, Muller made his move. He came in the morning, officially, with 2 soldiers. He requested Sigurd's fishing logbooks, the record of every trip, every catch, every route. Sigurd provided them without hesitation. They were accurate, complete, and showed nothing incriminating. They showed only the record of a man who fished the same waters the same way for 40 years. Muller read them in the garrison office for 3 hours. Then he called Sigurd in and placed on the table a single piece of paper, a map of the Sogne Fjord with all 3 grounding incidents marked in red ink. 3 incidents, Muller said, all at tidal phases that correlate with low water at the Fresvik Shelf and the Balestrand Shoal, all in conditions fog, darkness, night that would explain navigational confusion. Sigurd looked at the map. "Bad luck," he said. "The fjord is not forgiving of careless pilots." "No," Muller agreed. "It isn't." He looked at Sigurd steadily. "I cannot prove anything." "There is nothing to prove," Sigurd said. Muller folded the map. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower and almost without inflection. I am recommending, he said, that all patrol vessels on this route undergo a mandatory minimum tidal clearance protocol. That night runs be suspended during fog, and that the garrison request updated hydrographic surveying of the entire passage. He paused. I am also recommending that this village be classified as a low-risk population, cooperative, non-confrontational, no actionable evidence of resistance activity. Sigurd said nothing. The war will not last forever, Muddler said quietly. He picked up the folded map and put it in his coat pocket. Whatever else is true, the war will not last forever. He dismissed Sigurd. Sigurd walked home along the same road where old Marta Eilertsen had once stood trembling with her papers. He looked at the fjord. He lit his pipe. He allowed himself, for the first time in 3 years, to feel something very close to relief. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was the hardest of the occupation. Food shortages reached even the coastal villages. The garrison at Idavag was reinforced and then thinned and then reinforced again, reflecting the erratic pressure of a military machine that was beginning, in ways both visible and invisible, to feel the strain of the Eastern Front. Muller remained through the winter and left in February 1944, transferred Sigurd never learned where. A less attentive replacement came and went within 3 months. Sigurd did not attempt another operation against the patrol vessels. Muller's new protocol had made them genuinely harder to trap, and the strategic situation had shifted. The real work, the work that mattered, was the human chain, the ongoing facilitation of the Shetland bus network. Over the following year, he passed 2 more covert crossings through the cove. He sheltered a Malorg agent named Ragnhild for 11 days in his fish cellar, a woman 20 years his junior who spent her time in the dark reading a copy of Ibsen she had brought with her and who left without fanfare on a wet morning in April, moving north toward Bergen, and whatever waited for her there. He never saw her again. The cost accumulated in ways he had not fully anticipated. The solitude was the heaviest thing. He had always been a solitary man. The widower's life, the fisherman's life, both push toward quiet, but the solitude of a secret is different in texture from the solitude of grief. It sits differently in the chest. He could tell no one, trust no one, fully relax with no one. He ate his meals alone and sat by the fire alone and watched the fjord change with the seasons, and told himself that this was fine, this was manageable, this was simply what the work required. There were nights when he was not certain he believed himself. He thought sometimes about the men he had put in the water, the 11 airmen, the agents, the wireless operator Fletcher, whose face he could still remember clearly, that hollow, exhausted look of a man who had been afraid for so long that fear had become his resting state. He thought about Lars Eriksson, who had aged visibly, and who now drank more than he should, and who never spoke of any of it, not once, as if by silence he could make it unhappen. He thought about Muddler, which surprised him. He thought about what the man had said, the war will not last forever. Had it been a warning, a signal of private understanding, or simply the observation of a tired officer who knew by 1943 which way the mathematics were pointing? Sigurd had never resolved it. He carried it as an open question. He thought about old Marta Eilertsen and her shaking hands in the cold, and he decided on the mornings when the work seems too costly, too isolating, too much, that the answer to whether it was worth it was still yes. Not because of the patrol boats, not even because of Fletcher and the others, but because there is a kind of dignity that exists between people, an ordinary, fragile thing, visible in the gesture of a woman trying to show her papers to soldiers who are laughing at her, and the only response to its violation, the only honest response, is to refuse to let it go unmourned and unanswered. He could not explain this to anyone. He simply held it. In May 1945, the German forces in Norway surrendered. The news reached Idavag on a Tuesday afternoon. There was some noise in the village, a little crying, some shouting, the church bell rung by someone who had climbed the steeple, and then a long, quiet, collective exhale, like a coast that has been under pressure for 5 years finally releasing it. Sigurd stood at the end of the dock and watched the fjord. It was the same fjord, the same black water, the same granite walls, the same depth, which was to say, far deeper than any chart had accurately said. The same currents, the same tidal shelf near Frederick, the same underwater geometry that had, on a July night 4 years ago, offered him a tool and a possibility and a choice. He had made the choice that was in front of him. He believed that was all any person could do. He tapped out his pipe, turned and walked home. Sigurd Halvorsen never filed a resistance claim. After the liberation, the Norwegian government established a process for formally recognizing those who had participated in wartime resistance activities. Many did come forward, brave people who had kept radios, hidden weapons, passed intelligence, sabotaged infrastructure, sheltered fugitives. The official record of Norwegian resistance is long and honorable. Sigurd read about the process in the newspaper. He set the newspaper down. He did not contact the relevant office. He was not, he told Lars Eriksson, the only person who knew anything, a man who needed a certificate to know what he had done. Lars, who had his own reasons for preferring quiet, said nothing. They sat together on the dock in the September sun of 1945 and drank coffee and watched the fjord, and neither of them spoke about any of it, and both of them understood that this was the appropriate response. The 4 patrol boats, 1 sunk, 1 permanently disabled, 2 temporarily damaged, were logged in Kriegsmarine records as groundings due to faulty hydrographic data and navigational error in difficult fjordgraphic data and navigational error in difficult fjord conditions. This was, in the strictest sense, technically accurate. German naval investigations attributed the incidents to the same root cause, the inadequacy of their 1921-era charts. Improved surveying was recommended. No human agency was identified. In 1971, a Norwegian maritime historian named Professor Dag Christiansen published a monograph on the Shetland buss operations in the Sogne Fjord region. In a single footnote, he noted, based on an interview with a former Malord courier, that an unnamed fisherman in the southern Fjord district had served as a waypoint for at least 3 known crossings. He was unable to identify the fisherman by name. He described the individual only as a cooperative and quiet man who preferred to remain unrecognized. Sigurd had, by 1971, been dead for 4 years. He died in his own bed at the age of 78, with the gray cat's successor asleep at his feet and the sound of the fjord audible through the window he had left open. His children came back to Eidvåg for the funeral. They stood at the grave in the churchyard, a little uncertain, because they had not known him as well as they might have. He had not spoken much, in his later years, about the war. He had spoken about the fjord. He had spoken about the fjord. He had spoken about weather and current and the particular stubbornness of cold water fish. He had spoken occasionally about the importance of knowing where the real depths were not the depths the charts showed, but the actual depths, the ones that only long patience and the willingness to read the water carefully could reveal. His children thought he was talking about fishing. He was, in a sense, talking about everything. The Sogne Fjord still runs the same route today, south in the morning, north in the evening, through passages that are deeper and stranger than any official chart has ever fully captured. The water keeps its own record. The granite shelf near Fresvik sits where it has always sat, just beneath the surface, invisible at high tide, waiting. Some knowledge belongs to the water, and some belongs to the people who learn to read it.